We have a marvelous staff here and great volunteers, wonderful administration, but we haven't been able to function. We're trying to hang on like a lot of nonprofits right now. This lecture is designed to sort of keep things going. The blockade is perhaps the most famous naval subject in the history of the United States. It's very much maritime history, which is what the National Lighthouse Museum is all about. I thought that a series of lectures on the blockade would be something that'll kind of keep the light going this summer. But I think it's a good cause, and we certainly will appreciate if you participate with this program. Now, we've arrived at part 3, 1863 to 1865. And we'll start out with a painting by Edouard Manet, who happened to be in Cherbourg when the Alabama was cut down by the Kearsarge. And this is his painting. Now, Manet is often looked at as this transition between realism and impressionism. So some of his paintings have a very realistic look to them, and then you get the impressionist type of style that becomes so popular at the turn of the 20th century. And so here we have a little bit of both, but it's more of a realistic depiction of the destruction of the CSS Alabama. And this gentleman, I mentioned him before, Captain John Ancrum Winslow, who was credited with destroying the Alabama. And I said to you before, his coffin would be draped by the flag of the USS Kearsarge. Now, these Confederate commerce raiders became less of an issue. The companies that were involved in manufacturing a lot of these ships were British companies such as Laird Brothers, which operated out of Birkenhead, which is across the Mersey River from Liverpool. And I actually spent much of the summer in Manchester, England, back in 1983, doing research on Lebanon. It's had one of the best Lebanese collections. And since it wasn't a very safe thing to be in Lebanon at that time, my best bet was to be up in Manchester. So I took trips up to Liverpool, and I wanted to see where the Laird brothers actually built the Alabama Confederate commerce raider. And I remember taking the ferry across the Mersey, thinking about Jerry and the Pacemakers and that song, and realizing that here we have Jerry and the Pacemakers meets the Confederate ram Alabama, manufactured in Birkenhead. How many people are seeing the world just this way? But it was very interesting to see the complex of buildings that comprised the Laird brothers. Again, these were private companies. It was not sanctioned by the British government, although the British government may have been looking the other way. Still a lot of controversy about that. Lord John Russell was sort of a cagey character. He was the prime minister at one point. And the British were fishing in muddy waters, let's put it this way. But in the end, they could not support the Confederacy. Now, we have in July, now remember, we're not going into the Battle of Gettysburg or Antietam in this presentation, and for a good reason. Gettysburg has its own history. We need not get into it. It's a very important history. So does Antietam. But I want you to keep in mind that just right after the Battle of Gettysburg, we do have a second assault against Fort Wagner, which is a base, a fortress that lies at the outskirts of Charleston. And the Americans had not managed to take control of Charleston. They did get the Sea Islands, but Charleston was too well defended at that stage. But at Fort Wagner on July 18th, we have the 54th Massachusetts Regiment that is going to be organized by Robert Gould Shaw. And the great movie Glory, I think, depicts this very, very beautifully. And he was born into a prominent Boston abolitionist family. He accepted command of the 1st All-Black Regiment, the 54th Massachusetts, and he died during the siege of Fort Wagner on Morris Island in South Carolina. And that was July 18th, 1863. He was only 25 years old. I'd like to mention about this Fort Wagner. Was really what you'd call a sort of makeshift fort. This was not like Fort Morgan in Mobile, or certainly like Fort Sumter. Fort Wagner was made of palmetto logs and sandbags and earthenworks, and but it was still a very, very strong fortress, and it had an enormous amount of artillery, and it certainly played a role in slaughtering the 54th of Massachusetts. It did its job. It took 20 years for the entire fort to dissolve, to erode, because it was made simply of earthenworks and sand. So you can't visit the remains of Fort Wagner today. This is taking place as the Vicksburg campaign is also taking place. Now, Vicksburg is actually going to be fought over months, and it's going to culminate with a surrender of Vicksburg on July the 4th, 1863. And so we have a painting here depicting at least part of the coastline along Vicksburg. One of the things I think for you to keep in mind about Vicksburg is that there were 8 miles of fortified areas along the Mississippi that were extremely difficult to defeat. And this gentleman, Major General John C. Pemberton, was commander of the Vicksburg Fortress, and he's the one who surrendered to General Grant on the 4th of July, 1863. Lincoln made his famous statement that the Mississippi River again goes unvexed to the sea. Now that wasn't, it's a great quote, but it's not altogether true, because even though the Mississippi River was now brought under control, there still were tributaries all around the area that were bringing supplies to various parts of the Confederacy. But the fall of Vicksburg was one of the great events in this whole blockade operation. And so we have a photograph here showing Ulysses Grant and General Sherman. And the reason I'm showing them together is because they provide a very unified leadership. And throughout the war, Grant is always going to have Sherman at his back, supporting him. The relationship was very close and very poignant, and both men trusted each other enormously. Sherman himself had a lot of psychological issues. He had a nervous breakdown at one point, and it was really Grant that allowed him to kind of reestablish a very strong presence in the Army. And for his part, you know, when people kept accusing Grant of the worst possible things because of his drinking, Sherman was always there to be a support. And so the two became a really important force for the Union. Now, Grant himself, after the Battle of Vicksburg, is going to be made the Lieutenant General of the Army. He will eventually become 4-star General of the Army. He's going to take over the position that had been held by a series of incompetent generals, one of which was George McClellan. So he will head up all forces. Lincoln begins to write to him on a more personal basis and directly. He has great admiration for Grant. After this victory, Grant is going to become, in the media and among the population at large, very much a hero, because they understand how important Vicksburg is to the conquest of the Confederacy. During this time, and we have in April of 1864, we have an event that's going to have a powerful impact on the thinking of Sherman and Grant and even Lincoln. And it's a controversial massacre at Fort Pillow in Tennessee on April 12, 1864. It involves Confederate Commander Lieutenant General Nathan Bedford Forrest. And Forrest, as you may or may not know, eventually established the Ku Klux Klan. And he's looked at as one of the most notorious Southern figures. And the question is, did he sanction the slaughter of 300 black Union troops after they surrendered? Now, there's a lot of conflicting documents about this issue, and we don't have time to go into it. But what I would like you to understand, it's worth investigating. This book by Brian Steele Wills is well worth a read to get an idea about what actually happened at Fort Pillow. But I think it has an impact on Sherman and his effort to conquer Atlanta, burn down Atlanta, and march to Savannah, and show no mercy for the Southerners. And Grant himself, not at all a man who holds a grudge or has weak personality traits, but Grant understands very well that the object of this war has to be the destruction of armies, not necessarily the conquest of cities or towns, but the destruction of armies. And so he will focus his efforts on destroying the Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee, when he takes command of the Army of the Potomac and when he takes overall command of the Union forces. April in 1864, about the time of the Fort Pillow massacre, this is an election year. Lincoln desperately needs a victory. And Grant and Sherman will plan a campaign that will be led completely by Sherman. He's going to go south to Georgia. He's going to attack Atlanta, destroy the city. Because he's destroying all the communications along the way, there's not going to be a way to really keep in touch with Sherman. Grant has every faith that Sherman can do the job, but he's not able to communicate him via telegraph. And so there's a kind of a silence. What's going on down in Georgia? Well, what went on down in Georgia was pure hell for the people of Georgia. And we see, for instance, Atlanta had become, its original name actually was Terminus, which referred to its railroad importance. And it had railroads going in and out of the city in 4 different directions. It led the region in manufacturing, rolling mills, and industrial output, and it was second in strategic importance to Richmond, Virginia. There's a number of battles, one of which is Kennesaw Mountain, that very, very ferocious fighting. Eventually, he's going to manage to get into Atlanta. At this point, Atlanta only has a population of 3,000 people, mostly women, children, and some slaves. So there's not going to be any kind of opposition. Sherman is worried about what he's going to do with these people because he doesn't know how faithful they're going to be. If they take a loyalty oath, can he trust them? He's going to have to worry about them. He's going to have to feed them. He orders them out of Atlanta. There are still many, many people of that 3,000. We don't even know what happened to them. They went north, they went west, and we don't know the fate of a lot of these people. It's an extremely sad story. Anything of military value was destroyed. Churches were spared. Some historical structures were spared, but everything else pretty much was devastated. And here we have a picture showing some of that devastation. The invasion of Atlanta comprised the Battle of Peachtree Creek, the Battle of Atlanta, the Battle of Ezra Church, and finally the Battle of Jonesboro. August 31st to September 1st, Sherman ordered the city to be evacuated, then proceeded to burn it down. The fall of Atlanta, together with the Battle of Mobile Bay, which we're going to get to, on August 1864, helped Lincoln defeat George McClellan. Now, George McClellan's the one who wouldn't move his forces when he had every opportunity to do so. Why wasn't he moving his forces? Well, I don't think it was just because he was inept, although that may have been a big part of it. McClellan was a Democrat, and I think he didn't want to destroy the Confederate Army because he had political designs in 1864. So it's a very treacherous kind of character, this McClellan. And here we have the destruction of Atlanta's roundhouse, which was a great structure when it was operational. And then, right after the fall of Atlanta, Sherman is going to decide to make the march to Savannah, cutting a 60-mile swath through central Georgia, destroying every telegraph, every railroad, anything that can provide supplies. He's going to get to Savannah. Savannah already is in a very bad way. As we mentioned before, Fort Pulaski had been captured, and it wasn't that operational a seacoast city. It was getting most of its food from the Wilmington port, which was in North Carolina. But that's going to end pretty quickly. Here's a picture of McClellan, who I certainly, and I think most historians of the American Civil War, would look at him as one of the most unpleasant characters that you'll come across. Very arrogant. When General Grant was looking for a position, he went to Cincinnati, where the headquarters of McClellan was situated, and he had to wait days and days and never got a chance to even meet McClellan. That's how arrogant McClellan was. And McClellan had that same discourtesy for Lincoln. Eventually, things caught up with him. Here's a campaign poster showing Lincoln and Johnson, and they were going to win handsomely. Lincoln secured 212 electoral votes as opposed to 21 electoral votes for McClellan. Actually, only about 400,000 votes separated them on the popular level. So Lincoln got about 55% of the vote. That's a little bit more disturbing. But from the electoral point of view, he won against McClellan in a landslide. And one of the reasons, major reason for that, is the defeat of Atlanta and the defeat at Mobile Bay. So here we're looking at Mobile Bay. And this was a battle that was commanded by Admiral David Glasgow Farragut, who is going to end up becoming one of the great naval people in the history of the United States. And he's made a full admiral, and I wouldn't say he's as popular as Ulysses S. Grant, but he's pretty popular. Just a bit about him. He was originally from Virginia, but he remained loyal. By the way, 40% of officers of the Navy did remain loyal to the United States from Virginia. So we might have this idea that it was a mass defection on the part of the Virginians against the Union, but in fact 40% defected, and like Scott, Farragut decided to remain loyal to the United States. And in fact, he eventually, when we do our tour of the Hudson River, we go up past Hastings-on-Hudson, and I always point out that Admiral Farragut lived in Hastings-on-Hudson, established himself as a good New Yorker, and there's a Farragut Parkway located up there. And so at first, Gideon Welles was a little suspicious, but then his judgment, I think, proved to be accurate, and he knew that Farragut would be a loyal man for the Union. I have a picture here that shows all of the different rivers of Alabama. And I think this helps to put the Battle of Mobile Bay into context. As long as Mobile Bay was still functioning, these rivers throughout, the Alabama River and the Alabama was completely connected with a river system. And the only saltwater port, ocean port for Alabama, was Mobile Bay. So once you take the port of Mobile Bay, then you can block traffic along the river. Goods from Europe are not going to make it into Alabama, and you're going to be able to control a good deal of the commerce. The famous Battle of Mobile Bay, and there's a few things I want to mention about this that may disappoint you, because I think when people hear about David Glasgow Farragut, they always quote, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Well, there's, I think, a counter explanation to this that's probably worth knowing. In any event, these two forts, Fort Morgan and Fort Gaines, by the way, it's named after a War of 1812 hero named Gaines. Gainesville, Florida is named after him as well. And so Gaines and Morgan are the two forts that are guarding Mobile Bay. And when Farragut enters, he enters with 4 ironclad monitors, 12 wooden ships, 2 gunboats with 5,500 men, and he takes control over Alabama's only port city. Now, he's believed to have said, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." And of course, he's always looked at as a heroic figure for having said that. But here's the rest of the story. The quote might more accurately have been, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, 4 bells, Captain Drayton. Go ahead, Jewett, full speed." Farragut never claimed to give these orders. The phrase has been more accurately attributed to the commander of the USS Tecumseh, which was a monitor. And the commander, Commander Craven, is believed to have uttered those words. Now, you can go for the rest of your life saying that it was Farragut, but the research seems to indicate that it was Craven of the USS Tecumseh, a monitor that actually was destroyed by one of the torpedoes, one of the mines. And so it's not exactly what we think. But here we have, I love this painting of Farragut because it shows that kind of devilish look in his face. The man was not, whatever the truth of that story is, Farragut was a very brave man and an unbelievably organized and disciplined officer. And you can see in this picture the strength of his character and that little devilish sort of spark in his eye. This is a man who is very much in command and very beloved by his fellow naval men. The attack against Fort Morgan, August 5th, 1864. And so we have both Fort Morgan in this picture, and then in the next picture we see Fort Gaines. So throughout the war, the Union was smart enough, and the intelligence reports that Gideon Welles was receiving, it's not worth trying to get Mobile Bay just yet. They're just much too heavily defended. And so they waited until 1864 as the tide was turning and the anaconda was really beginning to choke the Confederacy. This is Admiral Farragut's flagship at Mobile Bay. It was the USS Hartford, and if you want to see the anchor of the USS Hartford, you can visit Fort Gaines, which has some really great museums and terrific displays. And meanwhile, we're back in Georgia, and it's the end of the year, 1864. To be exact, it's December 21st, 1864, and Sherman has now written a note to President Lincoln, which reads as follows: I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton. So he telegraphed that on the 21st, 4 days before Christmas. Lincoln was very, very happy to get that news. Savannah is, to all intents and purposes, cut off. Of course, the Sea Islands have cut off Confederate activity. Fort Wagner has been taken. Charleston is extremely vulnerable. And now what remains is the one port, Fort Fisher, that's going to guard the Cape Fear River. And Cape Fear is the entry point to the city of Wilmington. Now, Wilmington was a very prosperous city at this time, and it had all sorts of business activities, you know, tobacco and agriculture of every type, and a big timber industry, and you name it. Wilmington had become a very prosperous city. Wilmington, if it could be shut down, that would be the last lifeline for the Confederacy. Also Galveston, but Galveston was still operating on its own. It had not been defeated, but it was pretty far. And so it was considered, all right, the most important target is going to be Fort Fisher. So we have here a depiction of Fort Fisher protecting the vital trade route, Cape Fear Inlet, leading to and in and out of Wilmington Port. The movie Lincoln begins with the shelling, the bombing of Fort Fisher. And it survived an initial attack on December 24th, 1864, but was finally captured in a second attack on January 15th, 1865. Wilmington was the last Confederate port to fall to the Union under, according to Scott's Anaconda Plan. Here's an overall view showing Fort Fisher at the tip and the Cape Fear Inlet, and about 25 miles or so you get to the town of Wilmington. So Wilmington was really well protected, and but once you got past into that inlet, and the number of ships that were involved made it unthinkable that there could be further resistance. The hero of this attack is also going to be Alfred Howe Terry. He's going to lead an assault against Fort Fisher. He had distinguished himself at Port Royal in the Sea Islands, and also the siege of Fort Pulaski outside of Savannah, also at Morris Island, and which involved that 54th Massachusetts Regiment. and he was involved with the capture of Fort Wagner. So he's going to be, but he's most famous for capturing Fort Fisher on January 15th, 1865. And one of the interesting things I think to mention about Terry is that he really didn't have a military background. He had a legal background, but he learned about the military. He was very good at it and extremely well regarded by Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton. And here we have another picture showing the capture of Fort Fisher led by Alfred H. Terry. Now, we don't need to go into the final surrender of Lee to Grant at Appomattox and some of the campaigns that took place in Virginia, because that army was now, the accounts of the Confederates by observers in Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, were so pathetic. These poor men were dying from malnutrition. They didn't have shoes. Their eyes didn't seem to have any light. They were like walking ghosts. And why was that? Well, they weren't getting the supplies. They weren't getting the hogs and pork and everything from Jacksonville. They weren't getting all the foodstuffs from Vicksburg. They weren't getting anything. And they were starving, literally starving. In fact, there are accounts showing the Confederate men begging along the road as they were heading towards Appomattox, which is where the McLean house, where, by the way, Wilbur McLean is the man where the first major battle of the Civil War is going to take place, Manassas. And then he decides to move down to Appomattox in the Shenandoah Valley to get away from fighting. And that's exactly where the war is going to end, when Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox on April the 9th, 1865. So we don't need to get into any more detail than that. Scott's Anaconda Plan worked. And we can ask questions. Were all these grisly, horrible battles that took place, the Overland Campaign, which involved the wilderness, and the horrible battles of Coal Harbor, where the slaughter just seemed beyond comprehension. Were all these battles really necessary? Should Lee have focused out in the West more? Some people have faulted Lee for being too sentimental for Virginia, and that he should have been out west, where the Confederacy might have survived, had a better chance of surviving. But he was a Virginian to the end. And so he wasn't going to stay out of Virginia. It was because of Virginia that he decided to assume command of the Confederate Army. So there are so many what-ifs that we can talk about. But one thing is very clear. The Union blockade against the Confederacy was an outstanding success. And the people who were involved in implementing this blockade, David Dixon Porter, David Glasgow Farragut, Gideon Wells, joint operations with Ulysses Grant and authorized by Secretary of War Stanton. We had a lot of talent in evidence, and the blockade against the Confederacy did work. Now, at the end of the war, there's still one little problem that's existing with the British. The British have allowed Laird brothers in Birkenhead to fit these Confederate rams, which overall destroyed about 220 merchant vessels. And the United States is not going to forget that. During the presidency of Ulysses Grant, which began in 1868, he's going to get his Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, to negotiate a final settlement of what becomes known as the Alabama Claims. And it comes in the form of a Treaty of Washington. The United States wants reparations for all those merchant vessels and other ships that had been destroyed because the British allowed these ships to be built on their territory. So the British, understanding full well that you needed to be friends with the United States, there was no more idea in the mind of the British that the United States was, could be subdivided anymore. The American Revolution was over and the British would just have to live with it. So let's make a settlement that is in the interest of both sides. So by the terms of the Treaty of Washington, it resolved claims arising from the destruction of U.S. merchant ships and goods by the CSS Alabama, as well as the other ships I mentioned, including the CSS Florida and the CSS Sumter and a range of others. And it took place at the Laird Brothers Shipyard. Today, it's known as the Camel Laird Shipyard, same location in the town of Birkenhead. It was negotiated by the Secretary of State Hamilton Fish with British Representative Sir John Rose. The final award of $15 million, a very princely sum at that time, was duly paid by Britain in 1872. The U.S. agreed to pay Britain $1,929,819 for illegal international blockade practices while it ceded some fishing rights. The Treaty of Washington established the principle of international arbitration, and it helped initiate an effort to codify public international law in an overall attempt to arrive at peaceful resolutions to international disputes. So between the United States and Britain, it's going to be a very positive ending with good negotiations. The British realize that they did the wrong thing, and the Americans are going to be satisfied. It's going to take a lot longer for the South to heal after this horrible Civil War, but that's a whole nother story to discuss. For our purposes, we can look at the Union blockade being extremely effective. When you consider the relative expenditure of the U.S. Navy as opposed to the Army, you see that the Navy was getting quite an extraordinary bang for its buck, so to speak. Now, in the conclusion of his book, War on the Water, the Union and Confederate Navies, 1861 to 1865, James N. McPherson provides some important statistics to bear in mind when considering the role of the Union blockade towards securing victory. Total military expenditures of the U.S. government in the Civil War were $6.8 billion. Of this amount, the Navy cost $587 million, 1/12 of the total. By any measure of cost effectiveness, the nation received more than its money's worth for this 1/12. 671 warships of all types carrying 4,610 guns fought in the Union Navy. All but 112 of these were steamers and 71 were ironclads. The Navy purchased 418 ships during the war and contracted for the construction of 208 more. By 1865, the Union possessed the world's largest Navy, an extraordinary achievement for which Naval Secretary Gideon Welles deserves much of the credit. So again, we go back to the extraordinary people that Lincoln put in place, the extraordinary leadership of Lincoln himself, and the achievement of this blockade, its implementation, was one of, if not the greatest story of the American Civil War. Thank you very much. That went almost as long as the wood.